much for joining us this morning. My name is Trevor Reeve, and I'm the Director of the Division of Monetary Affairs here at the Board. And on behalf of the Federal Reserve, let me welcome you to the second Thomas Laubach Research Conference. We established this conference to honor the legacy of Thomas Laubach, former Director of Monetary Affairs. As this room well knows, Thomas was a renowned economist, an influential policy advisor, as well as a close colleague and friend. I would especially like to acknowledge Thomas's wife, Taniat, and his son, Larab, who are joining us here today. Thank you. This year's conference is a key element of the Federal Reserve's ongoing review of its monetary policy framework. And that is highly appropriate for this conference, given that Thomas played a critical role in the Fed's first framework review in 2019 and 2020. The research presented and discussed over the course of today and tomorrow will help inform the FOMC's discussions as the committee considers potential changes to its monetary policy strategy and communications. And we have the vast majority of the FOMC sitting right over here today. Let me extend our great appreciation to the paper authors, discussants, and panelists for investing their time and energy and sharing their insights with us. And let me thank all of you in attendance for contributing to what I'm sure will be a very engaging and productive conference. Before we turn it over to the chair, let me address just a few logistical items. For everyone's awareness, this conference is being live streamed on the board's website and YouTube channel, and the recording will be available for viewing later. Please keep this in mind when posing questions or making comments, and members of the press are here today as well. All of the conference materials, including the papers and the presentations, will be posted to the board's website. Each of our paper sessions will begin with a presentation by the author, followed by comments from a discussant, and then we'll open it up to the room for Q&A and discussion. Whenever making a comment or asking a question, please use a microphone so that people can hear you both in the room and, importantly, online. When you speak, please begin by introducing yourself, and please try to keep your remarks concise so we can create more opportunities for other people to participate. If you have any questions about anything related to today's conference, please find any of my colleagues around the room or outside who are wearing a white lanyard. They'd be happy to help you. With that, let me get us started by introducing Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell, who will offer opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor, and good morning. I'd like to add my welcome to everyone. Thanks for being here. Thomas Laubach's research and his broader support of the FOMC helped us better understand monetary policy, and it is fitting that this work will continue today in his name. Thank you to the authors of the papers, to the discussants, and to our panel participants, and thank you also to Trevor and his team for organizing this conference. A whole lot of work went into bringing us together. As in our last review, the 2025 review consists of three key elements: this conference, Fed Listens events at the reserve banks around the country, and policymaker discussions and deliberations supported by staff analysis at a series of FOMC meetings. In the current review, we will reconsider aspects of our strategic framework in light of the experience of the last 5 years. We will also consider possible enhancements to the committee's policy communication tools regarding forecasts, uncertainty, and risks. In 2012, the FOMC first codified our monetary policy framework in a document entitled The Statement on Longer-Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy, which we refer to as the Consensus Statement. The language in the opening paragraph, which has never changed, articulates our commitment to fulfilling our congressional mandate and to explaining clearly what we're doing and why. That clarity reduces uncertainty, improves the effectiveness of our policy, and enhances transparency and accountability. As chair, Ben Bernanke led the committee through the creation of that initial consensus statement, adopting a 2% inflation target and outlining our approach to achieving our congressionally assigned dual mandate. The framework laid out in that document broadly aligned with best practices for a flexible inflation targeting central bank. The structure of the economy evolves over time, and monetary policymakers' strategies, tools, and communications need to evolve with it. The challenges presented by the Great Depression differ from those of the Great Inflation and the Great Moderation, which in turn differ from the ones we face today. A framework should be robust to a broad range of conditions, but also needs to be updated periodically as the economy and our understanding of it evolve. From 2012 to 2018, the FOMC voted at each January meeting to reaffirm the consensus statement, in most years without substantive changes. In 2019, we changed that practice, conducting our first ever public review, and said that we would repeat such reviews at roughly a 5-year interval. There's nothing magic about a 5-year pace. We believe that frequency is appropriate to reassess structural features of the economy and to engage with the public, practitioners, and academics on the performance of our framework. Several of our global peers have adopted similar approaches to their framework reviews. At the time of the last review, we had been living for about a decade in a new normal characterized by proximity to the effective lower bound, with low interest rates, low growth, low inflation, and a very flat Phillips curve. If I could capture that era with one statistic, it would be that the policy rate had been stuck at the lower bound for 7 long years following the onset of the global financial crisis in late 2008. After liftoff in December 2015, we were able to raise the policy rate only very gradually over a period of 3 years to a peak of just 2.4%. 7 months later, we began reducing it, leaving the rate at 1.6% in late 2019, where it would be when the pandemic arrived a few months later. Policy rates in other major advanced economies were even lower, in many cases below zero, and in all such economies, inflation regularly ran below its target. The sense at that time was that when the economy next experienced even a mild downturn, we would be right back at the lower bound, probably for another extended period. The post-financial crisis decade had demonstrated the pain that that could bring. Inflation would likely decline in a weak economy, raising real interest rates as nominal rates are pinned at zero. Higher real rates would further weigh on job growth and reinforce downward pressure on inflation and inflation expectations. Reflecting these concerns, we adopted a policy to make up for persistent shortfalls from the inflation target, an approach that was common in the extensive literature on the risks associated with the lower bound. Given the downside risks to employment and inflation from proximity to the lower bound, and the need to anchor longer-term inflation expectations at 2%, we said that following periods in which inflation has been running persistently below 2%, we would likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. We also concluded that policy decisions would be informed by assessments of shortfalls rather than deviations from maximum employment. The change to shortfalls was not a commitment to permanently forswear preemption or to ignore labor market tightness. Rather, it signaled that apparent labor market tightness would not, in isolation, be enough to trigger a policy response, unless the committee believed that, if left unchecked, it would lead to unwelcome inflationary pressure. This change reflected our experience with long expansions that featured historically low unemployment amid low and stable inflation, suggesting that a policy approach that carefully probed for the maximum level of employment could bring about the benefits of a strong labor market without risking price stability. In the years just prior to the pandemic, for example, unemployment was at multi-decade lows while inflation ran below 2%. By December 2019, estimates of the longer-run unemployment rate had fallen sharply. The use of shortfalls acknowledged that a combination of low inflation and low unemployment does not necessarily pose an adverse trade-off for monetary policy. The economic conditions that brought us close to the lower bound and drove the changes in our consensus statement were thought to be rooted in slow-moving global factors that were likely to persist for an extended period, at least until our next 5-year review. And that might well have been the case had the pandemic not intervened. The idea of an intentional moderate overshoot proved irrelevant to our policy discussions and has remained so through today. There was nothing intentional or moderate about the global inflation that arrived a few months after we announced our changes to the consensus statement, and I acknowledged as much publicly in December 2021. We fell back on the rest of the framework, which called for traditional inflation targeting. Through the end of 2021, FOMC participants continued to forecast that inflation was likely to subside fairly quickly in 2022 with only a moderate increase in our policy rate. That projection was consistent with other central banks with different frameworks and the vast majority of forecasters. When the evidence showed otherwise, we hiked 525 basis points over a period of 16 months. The most recent data suggests that 12-month PCE inflation was 2.2% in April, far below its 7.2% peak in 2022. And in a welcome and historically unusual result, as this room knows, this disinflation has come without the sharp increase in unemployment that has often accompanied a campaign of rate hikes to reduce inflation. The economic environment has changed significantly since 2020, and our review will reflect our assessment of those changes. Longer-term interest rates are a good deal higher now, driven largely by real rates, given the stability of longer-term inflation expectations. Many estimates of the longer-run level of the policy rate have risen, including those in the Summary of Economic Projections. Higher real rates may also reflect the possibility that inflation could be more volatile going forward than during the inter-crisis period of the 2010s. We may be entering a period of more frequent and potentially more persistent supply shocks, a difficult challenge for the economy and for central banks. While our policy rate is currently well above the lower bound, in recent decades we have cut the rate by about 500 basis points when the economy is in recession. Although getting stuck at the lower bound is no longer the base case, it is only prudent that the framework continue to address that risk. While the framework must evolve, some elements of it are timeless. Policymakers emerged from the Great Inflation with a clear understanding that it was essential to anchor inflation expectations at an appropriately low level. During the Great Moderation, well-anchored inflation expectations allowed us to provide policy support to employment without risking destabilizing inflation. Since the Great Inflation, the U.S. economy has had 3 of its 4 longest expansions on record. Anchored expectations played a key role in facilitating these expansions. More recently, without that anchor, it would not have been possible to achieve a roughly 5 percentage point disinflation without a spike in unemployment. Keeping longer-run inflation expectations anchored was a driving force behind establishing the 2% target in the 2012 framework. Maintaining that anchor was a major consideration behind the changes in 2020. Anchored expectations are critical to everything we do, and we remain fully committed to the 2% target today. In the current review, the committee is engaged in discussions about what we have learned from the experience of the past 5 years. We plan to complete consideration of specific changes to the consensus statement in coming months. We're paying particular attention to the 2020 changes as we consider discrete but important updates reflecting what we have learned about the economy and the way those changes were interpreted by the public. In our discussions so far, participants have indicated that they thought it would be appropriate to reconsider the language around shortfalls. And at our meeting last week, we had a similar take on average inflation targeting. We will ensure that our new consensus statement is robust to a wide range of economic environments and developments. In addition to revising the consensus statement, we will also consider potential enhancements to our formal policy communications, particularly regarding the role of forecasts and uncertainty. As we have been reviewing assessments of the 2020 framework and of policy decisions in recent years, a common observation is the need for clear communications as complex events unfold. While academics and market participants generally have viewed the FOMC communications as effective, there is always room for improvement. Indeed, clear communication is an issue even in relatively placid times. A critical question is how to foster a broader understanding of the uncertainty that the economy generally faces. In periods with larger, more frequent, or more disparate shocks, effective communication requires that we convey the uncertainty that surrounds our understanding of the economy and the outlook. We will examine ways to improve along that dimension as we move forward. So let me end by saying thank you again for being here. We've been looking forward to all of us have been looking forward to being with you today and having these conversations that will occur over the next 2 days. These discussions will help broaden and deepen our thinking about these issues, and they're critical to the success of these reviews. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. We are going to just roll right into our first paper session today. On the agenda today will be sessions that address the 2 sides of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, employment and inflation, and also the strategies and tools used to pursue those goals. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie Aronson, who will moderate this panel.
All right, just give us a second here while we get set up. All right, great to see everyone here this morning. I'm super excited to be kicking off the session. I'm Stephanie Aronson. I'm a Senior Associate Director in the Division of Research and Statistics. And I was told that I could say a few words about why our first session is important, but the title of the first session, I think, pretty much speaks for itself. The labor market and maximum employment. It gets right to the heart of the Fed's dual mandate, so enough said about that. I think I'm also just going to take a very quick moment to introduce our two panelists. So our presenter is Aysegul Şahin. She's a professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University. And since we're here at this system conference, I'm also going to note that for many years she was our esteemed colleague at the New York Fed as a research economist there. Her work focuses on macro labor issues, including measuring maximum employment and unemployment, and labor force participation dynamics, which makes her a great person to get the session started. Our discussant, thank you, is Eric Hurst, although I suspect everyone could hear me, right? Never a problem. Our discussant is Eric Hurst. Eric is the Roman family distinguished service professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and his work lies at the intersection of macroeconomics, labor economics, and urban economics. He's worked on issues near and dear to my heart, like the decline in male labor force participation and welfare losses stemming from gender and racial discrimination. So I think with that said, Aysegul is going to get us started. And you'll have 30 minutes. Finish at 8:20.
Thank you for the invitation to this exciting event. I would like to see my slides if possible. Okay. My job here is to start our discussion on the employment side of the mandate, to define, measure maximum employment, and link it to price stability. As you can imagine, it's not an easy task, because while the FOMC set a clear target and linked that target to a specific indicator on the price stability side, the maximum employment mandate remains relatively ambiguous. And you can see it here in this paragraph that I took from longer run goals and monetary policy strategy. So this statement is going to be my guide throughout my presentation today. So I'm going to go over key aspects of this definition, the broad-based and inclusive side of it, being not directly measurable, changing over time due to monetary factors, and its assessment depending on shortfalls from maximum employment, which is based on an analysis of a wide range of indicators. And while doing so, I'm going to use an approach that I found useful over the years to connect directly to each aspect of this definition. So this is a flow approach that I'm going to bring in. As articulated nicely in an older paper by Blanchard and Diamond, the flow approach brings in additional accuracy and richness to understanding of the labor market. And as a result, it provides us a unified framework to be able to put together this wide range of indicators. An example I'm going to give you is going to be talking about unemployment and participation dynamics to highlight the common and distinct forces that shape both of them. And the second is it directly connects to the underlying labor market mechanism. Job finding and job loss are inherently subject to different frictions, and it's going to help me to identify these frictions. In addition, the non-monetary factors that make it harder to specify a certain level for any indicator will be better understood by using this approach, which is going to connect us to the price stability mandate. Moreover, we are able to distinguish the mechanisms, distinct or common, that will help us support a broad-based and inclusive goal. Having said that, even though I started by saying there is not a clear metric or measure, I want to start thinking about employment to population ratio as a key measure of progress towards maximum employment. Employment to population ratio is governed by two key forces. As we enter a recovery, it starts recovering because unemployment rate starts going down. On top of it, we might get some increase through the participation margin. And this simple identity tells me that since changes in participation is moderated by something that's very close to 1, changes in participation will be more important even than changes in unemployment in shaping employment to population ratio. And if you go back to 1940 to 1970 period, the second term was not very operative. In that case, it was appropriate to think about a full employment-unemployment rate as suggested by Bob Powell in 1971. However, things got more complicated starting in the 70s, and this margin started to be more active. And the difficulty arose especially when we faced the recovery following, this very slow recovery following the Great Recession and the pandemic, while we were trying to evaluate cyclical improvement in participation while we were facing a downward trend coming from the demographic structure in the economy. So how do I then think about what I should be expecting from this second margin? How do I think about participation improvements? The prevailing narrative goes back to Perry and Ocon in 1970s. The idea is based on the observation that the participation rate is mildly procyclical. So discouraged workers leave the labor force during recessions, and they wait on the sidelines and enter when the economy recovers. So this discouraged worker narrative is important because it makes us shift our focus to entry of marginalized groups as the economy recovers from a recession. So I want to now look at this mechanism in light of the flow approach and see how important it is, or whether this is the main mechanism that drives the cyclical pressures on the participation rate. For that, I want to go back to the household survey, and I want to divide individuals into 3 labor market states. You can do this using many more states as well. That would be helpful, but probably will not change the figure that much because we have tried that. So you can think about people in the labor force as employed and unemployed, and the others are non-participating. And you can see unemployment, even though it's our main focus almost all the time, as a stock itself is very small. But it still accounts for a lot of the turnover and job finding and job loss in the economy. So the first thing to notice, which is going to be useful for our discussion about vacancies as well, the churn in the economy is way bigger than net changes in the economy. So if there are changes in turnover in the economy, some of the indicators will tell us different things, so we have to think about their impact. But what's the most important thing here to notice is that even though being employed or unemployed from a definition perspective in a static sense does not matter for the labor force participation, it has implications going forward. Because an unemployed individual is about 10 times more likely to leave the labor force. So this mechanism I will refer to as the participation cycle. So it's not labor force entry and exit, but it's about employment stability that's going to drive this participation cycle. And let's look at how big it is. So now I'm looking at each recessionary period, and I'm decomposing the changes in the participation rate, which is the black line, into entry and exit components and the participation cycle. Obviously, I cannot do this if I look at a static framework. We rely on, for this, we rely on a dynamic decomposition that I built with my co-author, Bart Hobain, over the years. So when somebody loses their job and becomes unemployed, going forward, this puts downward pressure on the participation rate. And since considerations for maximum employment is forward-looking. This is an important channel that we should be thinking about. So the black line has been going up, obviously. We know female labor force participation, baby boomers, and then it starts going down. And the difficulty is then to evaluate where are the cyclical pressures. And as you can see, entry and exit behaves the exact opposite of what the prevailing narrative tells me. We see that it's actually pushing participation up early in recessions as entrants enter through unemployment and exits stop because people tend to increase their search intensity. But the component that's directly related to job finding and job loss that moves people within the labor force is unmistakably pro-cyclical. And interestingly, even though the recovery from the COVID recession was way faster than the recovery following the Great Recession, the dynamics are very similar in both cases. So moving on to this idea, but what about the unemployment rate? Because now we link job finding and job loss to participation pressures. What about the unemployment rate? We all know that job finding and job loss are very important, but given this unified framework, I could actually look at the determinants, the flow origins of the unemployment rate as well. And as you can see, the red one, job finding and job loss, are again the most important drivers. It's about 2/3 of the fluctuations in unemployment. But interestingly, in this case, opposite of the prevailing narrative, the entry and exit actually amplifies fluctuations in the unemployment rate. One interesting thing going back to economic mechanisms, as you know, the unemployment rate went up from 3.4% to 4.2%, and there was a fear that this was the signal of an impending recession. But if you actually look at flow origins of this, unlike previous recessions where job finding and job loss margin created this stark increase, contributed starkly, there was no such increase in what I refer to as the soft landing period. So this tells us that it's not only the increases in the unemployment rate, but the flow origins are also important to evaluate what to expect from that. So now that I have these cyclical components, I can go back and look at the importance of unemployment and participation cycles and see how they are evolving over time. So I'll take the same equation and I will look at the cyclical evolution. So this gives me my favorite indicators, the unemployment cycle, because the recession opens a hole in the economy. And then we try to get out of that hole, increase employment by reducing the unemployment rate and by creating employment stability through the participation margin. So the participation part is really important. It's at least 2/3 of the upward pressures in employment coming from that margin. But what's important for real-time policy considerations is that it lags. It lags around 9 months. It takes time to create this employment stability even after job finding and job loss prospects improve for workers. And one thought I had before looking at this was the participation recovery was very slow after the Great Recession because it was a very slow recovery. But if I look at the recovery from the pandemic, the same lead and lag structure actually applies. Even during brisk recoveries, we should expect this about 9-month delay in the pickup in the participation rate. And the evolution of participation actually followed this. We have seen meaningful increases in the participation rate after we hit the 3.4% in the unemployment. So then what about the inclusiveness of this? Because I'm still looking at that. I don't have time to show that, but when you do this for different demographic groups, the same mechanism applies for all. So it's always the employment stability, not the entry and exit. But perhaps, surprisingly, the leg structure is also very similar. Each group have very similar leg structures to the aggregate economy. So that this has the implication that we could shift our focus from entry of marginalized groups to employment stability of all workers. And the mechanism behind this is the same. It's job finding and job loss prospects improvement. So now What about price stability? One definition of maximum employment is the highest level of employment that does not compromise price stability. So now I want to take this flow approach and start thinking about the price stability part of it. So far, all I have shown you is how the economy progresses without telling you when we start seeing price pressures or where the natural rate should be. So I want to think about the natural rate of unemployment as the unemployment rate which is consistent with stable level of inflation, following Friedman's definition. And it's obviously as clear as also clearly specified in the statement, driven by non-monetary factors, and it's going to be time varying. While in the 70s, the idea was that 4% is the full unemployment rate, we have learned that there are big fluctuations in the natural rate of unemployment coming from slow or fast-moving factors. So I want to think about two different kinds of non-monetary factors. The first one I will refer to as U-bar. These are secular trends. They are easier to project because most of the time they are related to slow-moving demographics. So one thing about aging, we can stop it and it's deterministic. So it helps us understand these trends really easily. But then there is the second temporary labor market shifts. The difficulty about this is even though it's tempting to change the indicator that you are focusing on, from cycle to cycle, different labor market shifts happen. Mismatch increases on the job search intensity or changes in recruiting behavior of firms, they all appear in different cycles. So now what I want to do is to offer you a summary measure that is based on unemployment, that's consistent with stable prices, which is going to be a proxy for all these labor market disruptions. But I will use the secular trends as my anchor. It's going to help me identify this, because if I were looking at 1975, I would be able to see that because of all the demographic effects, all the baby boomers entering the labor market, there was an upward shift in the unemployment rate, which makes 4% an unreliable target. So obviously, once you have this, you could summarize inflationary pressures in the economy by defining the unemployment gap. Where is unemployment relative to the natural rate of unemployment? And this gap is going to be affected by where we are in the business cycle as well as monetary policy. So I want to estimate U star, which is obviously not an observable indicator. But what's observable is my anchor U bar. And you could also think of it being consistent with the long-run projections in the S&P that Chair Powell just shown us. So I want to do this in the context of a new Keynesian Phillips curve, which allows me to have a forward-looking view of inflation. Nominal wages will be sticky, and when they are reset, they will be reset taking into account where the agents will expect the labor market to go forward. And when I use this new Keynesian Phillips curve, I will be able to decompose total inflation into two components. The second part is going to capture the temporary supply shocks, changes in productivity, markups, labor supply disruptions, while the first one, which I refer to as the underlying inflation, will link labor market to inflation. The first component, obviously, is inflation expectations, long-run inflation expectations, but the second part will take this unemployment gap and moderate it through the slope of the Phillips curve. And this kappa obviously will be an important parameter. But what I want to take away from this is it's not only the contemporaneous output gap that matters, it's also the expectations about future unemployment gaps that's going to be a determinant of inflation. So we're going to estimate the natural rate of unemployment following the seminal work of Thomas Laubach in 2001. We are going to bring in the flow-based measure of the trend unemployment rate, median CPI, 5 different measures of labor compensation. And inflation expectations will tell me two things. One is how anchored they are in the long run. That's an important part of underlying inflation. And the second is how they vary in the short run, which is going to reflect what people expect for the unemployment gap to be in the future. So these will be enough for me to identify the natural rate along with the underlying component of inflation. So this is the natural rate of unemployment in black, but let me first anchor you with the red line, which is the secular trend. And as I mentioned, there was a big increase in secular trend, and this mostly follows the demographic structure of the US labor market, as well as the increase in female labor force participation. And currently, it's pretty much around the level that the longer run projections of the SEP is at the median SEP is at 4.2%. But what's more important for price stability is these increases in the natural rate. As you see in the Great Recession, there was an increase. And we discussed a lot what are these factors. And mismatch recruiting intensity, UI extensions, house lag, these were all explanations that came up. And our model, even though it's agnostic on the sources, is picking up this disruption. But it's not big enough to create a big decline in the unemployment gap, which is still remaining very high for a very long time because of the persistent unemployment rate. When we look at the pandemic, there was even a bigger increase to around 7%, which only subsided slowly. This time, factors are different. This is related to increase on the job search intensity. It's related to increases in reservation wages and extension of unemployment insurance benefits early on. But this also coincided with a brisk recovery in the unemployment rate, which brought the unemployment gap to negative very early on during recovery. And it became an important driver of the underlying inflation. So you can see the CPI in dashed lines, and pi star is the long-run inflation expectations. But the underlying inflation, that's the part driven by current and future labor market conditions, has started to pick up earlier, and it has been relatively persistent. And it still remains elevated, accounting for the remaining of the inflation that we are currently seeing above the 2% target. And also, I can give you an estimate of the supply shocks on the right-hand side. You can see that the big swings are driven by this, while the persistent component is related to the labor market. So what about disinflation? Because when we try to think about the relationship between unemployment and inflation, we often want to change our slack indicator, or we often want to change the slope indicator. But here, what I'm doing is I'm just using this forward-looking way of looking at inflation, and I'm only using a single slope. But the soft landing episode makes it harder to reconcile what has happened, because we have seen a substantial disinflation with very minimal increase in the unemployment rate. So if you look at this period, both in terms of CPI and underlying inflation, as well as a summary measure of wage inflation extracted from 5 different measures, bulk of the disinflation happened between 2022 Q2 and 2024 Q2. And after that, disinflation slowed down. If you look at expectations of unemployment from professional forecasters, that's on the left-hand side, that's when they started expecting unemployment rate to go up. And in the survey of consumer expectations, a Michigan survey, the fraction of households that expected unemployment rate to be higher also increased. And from the viewpoint of a new Keynesian Phillips curve, this is actually that summation term that reflects what people expect the unemployment gap to be. So you can reconcile the disinflation process, which is not really related to a big increase in the unemployment rate, to expectations about the unemployment gap to close due to Fed's actions. And interestingly, these expectations, this time period, coincides with Chair Powell's speech at Jackson Hole in 2022. So going back to my underlying inflation equation here, again, as I mentioned, there's this expected slack component that we think played an important role that speaks to Fed's credibility and communication. But what about the contemporaneous slack? Is there an indicator that I favor? Should I be using vacancy to unemployment ratio, or should I be thinking about changes in the slope? So one last thing about what I learned about vacancies when I looked at the flow approach, again, goes back to a simple accounting identity. Employment evolves because people separate from their jobs, and people get hired through vacancies. QT here is the job fill rate, ST is the separation rate. So the vacancy rate, in that case, can be written as a function of growth rate of employment. It could be payroll employment or household, doesn't really matter. Separation rate and the job filling rate. So the employment growth rate is about 100 times smaller than the separation rate. So most vacancies that we see are there to handle turnover in the economy. It's clear because employment grows by a couple of 100,000 where we have millions of vacancies. So any changes in job filling rate and separations rate will affect the vacancy rate in the economy. Put differently, an economy with high turnover should have a high vacancy rate to handle that turnover. And I think this is really key to understanding what happened with vacancies in this cycle. So I'm going to show you a simple counterfactual. The blue line here is the actual vacancies, and it picked up pretty much with inflation. That's why it has become an indicator that we started relying on to understand inflationary pressures. Now, what I'll do is first set the separation rate into its average. And in that case, I see the red line. So it's typically not very important, but you can see that during this time period, separations, especially quits, increased so much that they contributed to vacancies. One way this happens is people who quit leave a vacancy behind, and since these are vacancies that the firms typically want to fill, it opens up a vacancy change in the economy. And this becomes an inefficient process because you are trying to replace a specific person instead of expanding. And that's why job filling rates went down. And the second counterfactual, the orange one, shows you what happens if I shut down fluctuations and the job filling rate. And you can see that I really don't have much fluctuations in vacancies anymore, even though employment growth rate changed over time from negative to positive. And this tells me that vacancies are actually capturing turnover and job filling in the economy instead of forthcoming labor demand. And if I take the job filling rate, which Eric is going to talk more about, and look at how it moves with the underlying inflation that I extracted from my forward-looking New Keynesian Phillips curve, you see the remarkable co-movement. And the underlying inflation still remains elevated relative to its pre-pandemic level. And similarly, the job filling rate still remains suppressed relative to its pre-pandemic level, even though vacancy rates have come down, supporting the decline in matching efficiency. So let me end with a couple of key takeaways. In my view, this flow approach, thinking about turnover and movement of workers across the different labor market states, provide a nice framework to interpret a wide range of indicators. Most importantly, I'm able to understand the common and distinct factors that drive different indicators so that I don't rely on different ones at different parts of the cycle. And it offers these two real-time indicators, the unemployment cycle and the participation cycle. And this stylized fact about participation cycle lagging, even during brisk recoveries, I think is an important lesson I got from this calculation, because it highlights the importance of building employment stability for all groups in the economy. It also provides a bridge to understanding price stability because it gives me a handle on non-monetary factors. And we should, of course, recognize that there is not a perfect indicator and there is not a perfect model of the labor market. However, trying to understand the interconnectedness between them and the forces that drive them will be helpful when we confront the different recessions, different recovery dynamics, and different labor market trends. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to, there's more extra slides there that we didn't get to see. I'm going to take part of Aysegül's comments as a launching off point to talk about a little bit more on the last point she was talking about how useful the vacancy to unemployment rate is in terms of focusing on tightness in the labor market. And so I'm going to start with a comment that Aysegül had in her paper, which is basically, a lot of us in the macro labor literature have kind of come to from different angles, the conclusion that the vacancy to unemployment rate, we should be cautious about using that as a measure of future wage and price pressures. Now, on the other side, a lot of New Keynesian people have been putting this as the anchor of their models of, or modifying models of Phillips curves to try to put the vacancy to unemployment rate in. And so what is that tension between kind of the New Keynesian approach and what the macro labor people have been thinking about? And so I want to do that by focusing on another flow that Aysegül alluded to, but I want to flush it out a little bit more. How much churn in the labor market is occurring among the unemployed relative to how much churn is coming from unemployment into employment. And so during this recent period, we see that the E to E flows, the amount of churn in the labor market among workers, was at, again, in JOLTS data, I don't want to use the word all-time high here. I could go back further in the CPS, and it is among all-time high periods in the data this period. And so you could see like a 20% increase in E to E flows relative to the other peak periods over this time period. And I don't show it on this picture, but the U to E flow didn't move that much. It wasn't like we were drawing a lot of workers in on the margin among, from the unemployed into employment around this period. And so is there something in the information between the E to E flows relative to U to E flows that could potentially be important about underlying shocks that are hitting the economy, and then moreover, how those shocks might propagate through future wage and price pressure? And so that's what I'm going to try to talk a little bit about now. So what are some of the stories that people have put forth of why you're getting churn in the labor market relative to drawing people in on the margins? And I'm going to give you 3 stories. We could probably think of a couple more as well. One of which is there's sectoral productivity shifts. In particular, some sectors get more productive during this time period relative to other sectors. People are going to migrate from the unproductive sectors to the productive sectors. That's going to have a flavor of a regular productivity shock that we would have in our model. You would get some wage increases and potential price increases coming from the fact that people are doing churn if some sectors are more productive than others. Aysegül, she didn't even mention it, has some separate work about amenity shifts in the labor market during this time period. Work from home, and if work from home is an amenity, that actually puts downward pressure on wages because people are going to be compensated in ways that are not monetary, and potentially downward pressure on inflationary prices, inflation going forward. So if the churn is coming from work from home, we might not be worried about future wage and price pressure. And then there's a third story, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the next slide, is that there's an inherent identification problem with inflation and vacancies per se, in the sense that the inflation itself could cause churn in the labor market. In models with nominal wage rigidities, when inflation comes, real wages fall, and then you might get workers resorting to try to escape their nominal wage rigidity. And the data during this period, and I'll kind of allude to some of it, kind of showed stories 2 and 3 might be more important than story 1 during this type of period. So let me just kind of mention that third story a little bit more in depth. This kind of stuff that I've been working on with Hassan Afrouzi and Andres Drenik and Andres Blanco in a paper we have called, A Theory of How Workers Keep Up with Inflation. It's a very literal title. But in that, it was really just what happens when you shock an economy with inflation in a general model of labor flows with nominal wage rigidities. And in that model, as I said before, real wages fall. Churn is going to occur in the labor market as people are going to try to escape their nominal wage rigidity. That's going to create an incentive for firms to post more vacancies. There's lots of workers churning. You're going to get vacancy durations going up as people are going to be wanting to find a job quicker, so the job finding rate's going to increase, the job filling rate is going to fall. You're going to see lots of patterns we have in the data that don't result from any other underlying labor market shock except the inflation itself. Now, we know the inflation is not exogenous. It was caused by stuff. But even in that narrow kind of component, in that partial equilibrium sense, that's where the identification comes from. And I'm going to show you that identification problem is going to be more severe in periods when we think aggregate supply shocks are going on. And so my second comment is going to be, can we use these labor market flows to potentially learn about the underlying labor market shocks in the economy? So this is a picture I show, and I'm going to flesh it out a little bit more in the next few slides. So this is the vacancy to unemployment rate in the United States going back to 1950. So up to 2000s, it is JOLTS data. Prior to 2000s, it is the help wanted ads, from the newspapers. And you will see that there are 8 spikes over the 1950 to 2024 period in the vacancy to unemployment rate. 4 of those spikes are going to look like traditional hot labor market moving along a beverage curve kind of stories. During these periods, the unemployment rate was falling sharply as the vacancy rate was rising. During this period, nothing else was interesting was going on in inflation. It kind of looks like the story that when we want to put these vacancy and unemployment rates in our new Keynesian models, this kind of looks like what they're trying to capture during those periods. But there's 4 other periods. 1974, 1979, 1951, and the current pandemic period, where the vacancy to unemployment rate was at relatively high levels. The unemployment rate moved somewhat during this period, but not a huge amount during these down periods. But yet, the inflation rate was relatively high. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to try to correlate in a very simple way whether shifts in Phillips curves, which we usually think occur when supply shocks are around, are correlated with shifts in beverage curves when the vacancy to unemployment rate is going up, holding the unemployment rate constant. Now, my Phillips curve I'm running here is not going to pass the new Keynesian test in any sort of way. I'm not including any inflation expectations or such. I'm just going to correlate the inflation rate on unemployment and unemployment squared. I want to get a little nonlinearity in there as well. I'm going to take the residuals from that regression. I'm going to do the same thing with the beverage curve. I'm going to take the vacancy to unemployment rate, run it on the unemployment rate and the unemployment rate squared, take the residuals of those regressions. And I'm going to ask the question, are those residuals correlated? And then the second question, can we get supply shock potentially aggregate supply shocks potentially driving some of that correlation? Here's the correlation in those residuals in the data. What you could see, again, on the x-axis, I'm doing this 2 periods. Again, my limited New Keynesian knowledge knows that there were periods when the Phillips curve was steep or something like that. So I'm breaking it into a 1950 to 1989 period and then a total period. It doesn't matter on the period. That's all I'm trying to convey here. And what you can see is the periods when the high Phillips curve residuals, or basically high inflation conditional on unemployment, are correlated with high vacancy to unemployment rates conditional on the unemployment rate. In those periods in the upper right quadrant of these graphs are all 1950, 1974, 1979, and this picture doesn't have, but if I included it through the pandemic periods would be in there as well. Now I'm going to do something, again, very simple. I'm going to ask if I project some measure of supply shocks, and again, a very naive measure of supply shocks, just oil price movements on as a potential driver of the inflation. Again, I'm going to driver is a strong word, correlate of the inflation. And ask if I isolate the variation in inflation that is coming from oil price movements, do we still see this relationship? And the answer is yes. So what I'm basically showing you now is just the regression of those residuals on each other, where I instrument in the second column for the inflation with the oil price movements. And these numbers are kind of big. These are basically saying like a 10% movement in the inflation rate moves the vacancy to unemployment rate by about 0.2 percentage points, depending on the columns you're going through. The average vacancy to unemployment rate is about 0.65. So these are kind of big movements in the unemployment rate, in the vacancy to unemployment rate over time here. So there's some periods of time where the vacancy to unemployment rate might be picking up something else relative to our notion of a hot labor market going forward. Okay, 5 minutes, I'm almost done. So what I'm going to do in my last few minutes is going to ask one last thing, and again, this will be relatively quick. Okay, so there's certain types of flows that might be informative of shocks. In particular, E to E flows relative to U to E flows might be some moment we could look at to get a sense of the churn in the labor market by drawing new people in. The third comment is going to be, can we use other types of moments, and particularly the wage data itself, to help us learn about the underlying shocks? And again, this picture has been around now in our discourse among policy and academics for a little while, but in real time, it is something we might have looked at a little bit more. This is the real wages from the Atlanta Fed, just for the CPS data I just downloaded from the Atlanta Fed wage tracker index. The median wage in the United States, they had nominal, I just deflated by the CPI. Started in 2016, ran this forward. And what you could see is during this period of time, when the vacancy to unemployment rate was going up quite sharply, real wages were falling. And if you take a look at where real wages are today for the median worker, it is not too far where they were at the beginning of the inflation period. They fell and they've rebounded, but they're rebounding back to kind of the levels they were at the start of the inflation. And yet, real wages have a trend. And so relative to trend, we are still below trend. Now, maybe the trend changed, okay? But in that world, if there was something like a productivity shock that reduced the trend, that should have also had some downward pressure on wages. So using these wage metrics to think about, in real time, what is the underlying shock? I'm going to show one more moment, and then one more thing, and then I'll conclude. The one more moment is the wage change of stayers on a job relative to changers could also be informative. Because in a churn, if it's a high productivity market, labor market going on, the real wages of those who are churning might actually rise. They didn't in this data. So this is, again, from the Atlanta Fed. I worry about the switcher data in the Atlanta Fed because they miss all the people who change houses at the same time they change job. The ADP data, which I have the micro data for that, you get slightly higher growth for the job changers, but still, it's not like the job changers were getting a boom. It looks like the job changers were just relatively keeping up with inflation, where the job stayers were actually taking real wage declines. And this is my last one. The sectoral data also provides us some information of potential underlying shocks. The story of sector reallocation, you might see flows moving from one sector towards another sector in the data. Here, I mean, again, using a combination of JOLTS and the Atlanta Fed data, you could see there is variation across sectors. But the first thing that sticks out for me, every sector had massive increases in vacancies during this period, and every sector had real wage declines during this types of period. Consistent with the inflation itself eroding away the real wages and maybe potentially generating some churn in the data. I should mention that the real wage declines for the top of the wage distribution have been much greater than at the middle and the bottom. And again, if we think working from home is something that hits more the top of the wage distribution than the bottom, that could also potentially explain some of these patterns. And Aysegul has some work on that as well. Okay, so that's my comments. So, the labor market flows, I just want to echo what Aysegul was saying. The labor market flows can be informative of future inflationary periods. She focused on the U-star part. I'm saying, just in general, there's another moment, the churn in the labor market relative to, among the EDE switchers, relative to who we're drawing in on the margin could also be informative. Periods of aggregate supply shocks, which we all tend to think there was at least some component of an aggregate supply shock in this recent period, tend to be associated with both shifts in the Phillips curve and the shifts in the Beveridge curve. The real wage decline generates churn itself, and the labor market responds to that churn. And then the wage data and the other sectoral data could shed some light on some of these potential underlying mechanisms. Okay, that's all I got.
Okay, so now we have 30 minutes for Q&A, and since this is the first Q&A session, I'm just going to lay out a few rules about how this is going to go. To make sure we hear from a wide range of people at the start, I'm only going to let people ask one question. If there's time at the end and no one is asking questions and you have a second one, we can come back to that. Also, I have a reminder that we're not going to be taking questions today from the esteemed members of the press who have joined us here. There are microphones in the room, so before you ask your question, make sure that you've received a microphone. And although it doesn't say this in my instructions, I actually think it would be nice if you introduced yourself before you ask your question so we can all hear from who's asking the questions. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions at a time, then give our presenters a chance to respond, and then I'll take some more questions. So with that, Larry, you've had your hand up already, Adriana, and Mark, why don't we take your question, and then we'll get to Joe after. So Adriana, you can go and then give.
Maximum employment is one of the most vacuous terms in all inflation dynamics. You can't have a level as a measure of objective. It has to have the word sustainable in it, and it has to be related to the inflation objective. Now, you get away from that in a while. It has to be a zero slack concept. It has to be a zero slack. And of course, there are many of them, but we could look at many of them. We can't look at everything, but that's what we have to look at. So you get away from the maximum employment, fair enough, and get to that point. But it's very important. I won't win this battle. They'll always refer to maximum employment. The previous statement looked at minimum sustainable unemployment. Got it right?
Thank you, Adriana Kugler, Governor of the Federal Reserve Board. So congratulations on a great paper. There is a lot to like about it. I think something that was really helpful was how you really embrace all 3 definitions of U-star. The bottom-up approach with flows data, the NIRU, consistent with the stable prices, and the FERU, which is the full employment rate of unemployment by using the V2U as well and incorporating that. So lots to like. I had some concerns about how you move along with this, especially in terms of measurement. So in terms of measurement, I had 3 concerns. So it's one question, but 3 different measurement issues. So I'm sticking them all in. So first of all, your measure of inflation expectations is really reliant on the forward-looking nature of inflation expectations, but yet we know from recent literature, including the paper that will be presented next, including some of the literature that I cited in my speech at Princeton, that consumers and businesses really rely on recent experiences, right, to understand where the inflation expectations stand. So I'm just wondering how you would address that tension in the model, because you're relying on forward-looking inflation expectations, yet what we know from the recent literature is that what really counts is these short-term experiences and short-term inflation expectations in terms of forming inflation expectations even in the long run. The second issue that I was concerned with is the fact that you use CPI to measure inflation. And we know that, in particular, the CPI relies a lot on housing inflation, which has been incredibly persistent, and that would likely push up the U-star. And that takes me to the third issue, which is when you move to that second step of getting from the trend to U-star and from your flows data to measuring U-star, then you get something very, very odd, which is that we get a negative U-gap for the most recent period. Somehow you must be overestimating U-star. Something that you don't do when you get to that second step is actually to use the labor force participation flows. And so that concerns me, because you started the talk by saying how important these labor participation flows are, and yet you don't use them in that second step. So again, I'm worried about really biasing up your estimates of U-star, which in turn lead to this very odd result that you have a negative U-gap all throughout the past few years. So thank you.
Marco Del Negro, New York Fed. So great presentations and great discussion. I have one really quick question. So Aisha, when I look at the picture of the level of unemployment that is consistent with 2% inflation, my reading of that picture, the gray line, was that level right now is about 6%, so that we have to bring unemployment up to 6% to achieve 2% inflation. And the gist of Eric's presentation was, as my reading, very different, and in particular the picture on the real wage suggests that the labor market and the real wages are still below trend, so the labor market is not that hot. And I find it hard to reconcile the two stories. I wonder if you can help me. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's turn to the panelists now.
Okay, first of all, Larry, in terms of maximum employment, I think it's a holistic definition, and that's what I try to reflect. But one thing I try to do is how far you can go by just thinking about jobless and job finding that are main drivers of the unemployment rate, and I use unemployment as my aggregate proxy for those forces by showing that even though we tend to think of participation as additional slack, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way when we think about the cyclical pressures on it. And I think I totally agree with your statement, but one issue with declaring a full unemployment level is obviously the ongoing trends. Adriana, a couple of comments. First of all, we use short-term inflation expectations along with long-term inflation expectations as well, and they are the reason why we are seeing the U-star elevated. We have tried different measures of inflation. I think what the model is interpreting as the remaining persistent inflation is it's related to what we are seeing in the labor market. And one thing Eric showed is what happened to real wages, and you have seen that they actually started going up after this time period. And in terms of Marco's question, no, it doesn't mean that we have to increase unemployment to 6%, because as I have shown, the future component, the determination that we will reduce inflation even if unemployment has to go up to 6% was behind the disinflationary process. So in that case, When you look at when the inflation progress stalled, it was when those expectations of hard landing actually declined. So that's the connection that I see. But I've shown you that job fill rate, matching efficiency, those indicators are still looking different in the labor market, and our indicator is picking that up. But I want to emphasize that the 6% does not really mean that we need unemployment at 6% to see inflation at 2%. It's just a proxy measure that's telling us that there's a persistent component of inflation that's driven by what we are seeing in the labor market. Thank you.
I'm just going to say one more part to Marco's question. You know, when we see the real wages today, I show relative to trend, and it does look like there's a gap. But there's an implicit assumption in there of what is trend and where things are. That part I get a little bit more, uncomfortable with, in the sense maybe the trend had fallen during this period. So you need a little bit more structure in order to do relative to trend stuff. Now, at the same point, there is a work from home component that might be an amenity that does show up in wages that could also be floating around, which does complicate that inference a little bit more. I just want to end back, though, to where we started, that, both shocks and future responses is going to be a function of supply and demands in all markets. And so focusing only on the quantities without the price, it seems like we're throwing away information. And so I just want us to be thinking that the price also has some information in it as well. And it doesn't look like the labor market is overly hot by any sort of these measures. Now, the question of how far below trend we are, that, I need a little bit more structure with some assumptions in order to make that conclusion.
Joe Gagnon, Peterson Institute. My question for Aysegul is, have you considered, in your estimation of the U star that you use the linear New Keynesian Phillips curve, and have you considered something that's more nonlinear like we actually see in the data? I conjecture it would make a big difference in the following sense. You find a very high U star of around 8% in the late 70s. And I think that's because with your linear model, you need a big unemployment gap to explain why inflation pressures are so high. But if you were actually allowing for the fact that the curve is much steeper in that region, you wouldn't need such a big gap, and you'd actually get a more sensible U star. It would be lower than 8%. And conversely, after the Great Recession, you have to have a very small unemployment gap to explain why inflation is so stable. But in fact, if you allowed for the fact that the Phillips curve is much flatter there, you wouldn't need to force U to equal U star anymore, and you could actually allow the fact that U star was much lower than U at that point.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask a little bit more what the intuition and also sort of the data reasons behind the low match efficiency. And the reason I ask is, if I look at figure 15, it looks like there's a downward trend in the job filling rate. And this is putting a lot of demands on the data. But the source of that, if it relates back to sort of the willingness or duration of filling vacancies, and there's a trend in that behavior, that would change how we think about other things like a potential trend in V/U ratio, the slope of the beverage curve, the number of structural components we're looking at in this paper and elsewhere.
Hi, Alp Sumsek from Yale University. A great session. So I have a quick question for both Eric and Aysegul. I really like the mechanism Eric presented, that inflation induces people to leave their jobs to get higher wages. But if I think about that mechanism, I would expect it to show up in a higher quits rate. And while quits have increased in the recent cycle, Aysegul showed us a decomposition exercise that if you kept quits at historical rates, vacancy to unemployment ratio would be a little lower, but not much. So I was wondering if you could help us understand quantitatively how much the mechanism Eric described contributed to the vacancy to unemployment in the recent cycle.
First of all, I'm sympathetic to thinking about nonlinearities, changes in slope, or changes in indicators. But the reason why I prefer this approach is it gives me something that's called U-star that I can relate to the secular trend of unemployment, and then I can actually look at mechanisms. For example, during the Great Recession, when we looked at the impact of mismatch unemployment or recruiting intensity, it was really picking up that disruption in the labor market, even though all around inflation remained pretty stable. So that's why I'm not thinking about nonlinearities. And as for the 70s, again, part of why we have seen very high inflation is the natural rate was severely underestimated to be at 4%, while demographic factors was already making 7% a pretty good goal in terms of reaching maximum employment. Low matching efficiency, I mean, obviously we have looked into the details of this, and this also relates to Alp's question. So from a simple decomposition perspective, the impact of separations was small, but its composition shifted towards quits. And quits left vacancies. And those are called replacement vacancies, and they became more important over time in the US economy. And replacement hiring is less efficient. You take your time to think about how to replace someone who left because they produce a certain good or service that you want to make sure you can fill in. So that's one of the reasons why we are seeing this decline in matching efficiency. And this is the link between turnover and job filling rate that we started to recently appreciate. Replacement hires and expansionary hires are very different. And the initial time period where people were looking for remote job opportunities or they were looking for jobs to reset wages created a big vacancy chain. And these vacancies were harder to fill, so they pushed up the stock of vacancies, even though they weren't really increasing employment. So there's a wedge between vacancies and employment growth that's accounted for by the rate that you can fill separating workers. And I think that's what's been happening here. And in terms of remote work opportunities, as you know, this has stabilized about 2 years ago. So this inflationary force is no longer there. Now, when you look at high-wage workers, they are back to the usual job ladder considerations. So they are getting their wage increases because there is less to extract in terms of humanity. We are back to more or less 25-30% days worked remotely. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing to Alp's comment. The quit rate was at a historic highs as well, also by about 20%. So the quit rate and the vacancy rate tracked each other extremely closely over the cycle. And the quits weren't going to unemployment. It wasn't like we were seeing a huge amount of people quitting out of the labor force. So the quits in the churn are exactly the same phenomenon. And I love lots about the Aishigel's paper. We got to take those counterfactuals a little bit with a grain of salt, because those are kind of definitional counterfactuals. They're not, you're holding one part fixed when everything else is the constant. If you run those through models, those things some of those things will co-move together for various reasons.
Great. Okay, more questions? Lou? Oh, Chris, sorry.
Hi, Lou Alexander, Rocos Capital. Thanks, this has been a great discussion. I'm thinking about a lot. One of the things I find remarkable, though, is you're talking about all of this and there's no discussion of the technology of how people go about doing these searches. If I just think about how much the world's changed over this period, how the fact that it's all online now, we used to have to use help wanted advertising. That's got to have some effect. And I've seen some research that suggests vacancies are easier to post now. So part of the reason they have sort of trended higher is it's just easier to have one. So I'm curious how you think about how that's changed over time, and does that have any effect on how you think about this? Thanks.
Yeah, just a couple comments on Eric's point. So first on the real wages, I mean, whenever you have a supply shock, you're going to have a fall in real wages. That's going to be true regardless of the model that you have. Second thing is using a kind of a spot market measure is maybe not the best way to think about people that are professional in that. They're not going to go out and immediately look for a new job or quit or anything. We may hope that because it's a long-term relationship, our wages come up later, which kind of is what you showed. And the last thing is on the shift in the beverage curves because of the supply shock. I mean, that was one of the things that Andrew Vergara and I were looking at. And this is back to Joe's comment. When you're on a very steep portion of a nonlinear beverage curve, and then you have some matching inefficiency that maybe shifts the curve up, when you're on the vertical part, it's not going to have much of a quantitative impact. That's exactly what Andrew and I did. We took the Blanchard and Summers estimate of matching inefficiency, plugged it into ours, and basically it didn't really change the quantity effects because you're just on these vertical portions. And shifting up a curve when you're looking at the vertical portion doesn't really change the fundamental results.
On vacancies, I agree. There's a change in technology in terms of where vacancies were. In the Great Recession, actually, there was a shift. But I don't think there was a big change in technology of vacancies relative to 2019. But this speaks to the point that I was trying to reflect. If we want to think about a different measure in a Phillips curve framework, it's going to have its own natural rate. An economy with high turnover will have a high V over U to accommodate that. So we can't just get rid of this concept of the natural value of that indicator. A trend, such as you mentioned, would actually drive vacancy to unemployment ratio to a different level. But I don't think we have had enough changes relative to the pre-pandemic in terms of the technology. Even though if you go back, obviously there were changes. Thank you.
I'm just going to kind of echo one thing. You know, the cyclical variation should be relatively robust to the trends. The long-term relationship, you know, I think that is true. If my booth deans are listening, my real wage and my nominal wage chugged along at about 3% per year through the whole thing. My real wage, you know, the whole contract had shifted down. And I do want to say one, you know, when we see these E to E rates shift, we went from like something, I don't know, 2.3% of us churning per month to something like 2.6 or 2.7% of us churning per month. You know, so that's a big change, but you know, 0.4 churning per month integrated over, you know, a 25-month period, we're only getting the extra churn we're seeing in the population is only like 6 to 8% of us kind of going through. So there was some, even though many people are in these long-term relationships, there was some on the margin that actually churned a little bit more. I just want to make sure we keep the magnitudes, even though the percentage shifts are a lot, the actual amount of people that were doing these churns were you know, modest in scope, even though they were big in percentage shifts.
Yes, Lorenzo Giorgiani from Tudor. One of the features of the pandemic recovery was the fiscal policy activism and the fact that because unemployed people were being made whole, the unemployment rate was not really, or any other labor market indicators were not capturing well demand shortfall. How do you think about bringing in fiscal policy if it remains activist in the future, and from a perspective of a policymaker trying to set the right interest rate, it seems to me they're focusing only on sort of measures of slack based on flows or however you want to define them, might be missing the fact that demand might still be strong if unemployed people are made whole.
Hi, Julia Coronado from Macro Policy Perspective. So I don't have a particular question. I reiterate the concern about upward trends in vacancies. But I think your idea that there was sort of a level shift in the pandemic and since then is a perfectly reasonable conclusion. Yeah. But I just want to say that I love this work. I love this work and the discussion. I think it's incredibly valuable to connect the mandates and think about the dynamics of the labor market in a way that can be measured in real time, this could be so, so valuable for Fed communication and understandable by the public. So congratulations on this work. I love it all, and I love this discussion, and I think this is really important advancement.
Yes, Sylvana Duke, San Francisco Fed. Maybe a question for Eric, but feel free to weigh in as well. In terms of the three sources, the three sources of shocks, maybe like sectoral productivity or amenities, changes in amenities or nominal rigidities, I was wondering if you don't also have to think about worker heterogeneity. So you showed heterogeneity across industries, but not everyone can work from home, for instance. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the real wage behavior behaved differently at the lower end of the skill distribution than higher skilled workers.
I'll start with Sylvain's question. It's true, and it's actually consistent with the fact that high-wage workers got increase in their job values through amenities. This allowed them to probably save some money, commute time, and there's a lot of evidence on that, spend more time with their families, also be able to move to areas where housing costs are smaller. So there is definitely job value increase for high-skilled workers, while for workers with lower educational attainment, since there was no that opportunity, there was higher wage increases. I think it's consistent with this mechanism. But now that that reallocation is pretty much over, we are back to the good old job ladder, where job-to-job transitions create real wage increases. So that's consistent with this idea of U-Star being elevated. In terms of fiscal policy considerations, I mean, one thing that we always do is we always try to think about what's different this time. And when we thought about entry and exit, we've specifically focused on the COVID recession because we thought the dynamics would be different. With the exception of the lockdowns where there was a way of exit that was followed with entry, the dynamics of participation looked the same. Having said that, we have seen real increases in reservation wages of especially for workers with lower education. So we see fiscal policy affecting willingness to work along that dimension. But in terms of participation dynamics, at least the forces that are driving it, things look very similar.
So,
and thank you, Julia, of course.
I'll just, one thing on Sylvain's question. You know, there is heterogeneity across the wage distribution. Real wages at the bottom have now just kept up on trend. So if I show those gap kind of relative to, so even though nominal wages were higher, if you kind of put it in real wages and relative to trend, they're right back on trend. Relative to the top is not. And in models where, you know, we could calibrate with data, the bottom just churns more for some of the reasons we were just talking about. We're in long-term relationships, we don't churn more. And so that elasticity of when you have an inflation shock and you want to reallocate, it is much easier at the bottom where the long-term contracting is less, more spot market-like than it is at the top of the distribution. And that's exactly in our model. We can match the distribution by just for exactly the same reason of the elasticities of different wage groups.
And if I may add, I mean, in terms of remote work as an amenity, its cost, its effect on productivity, the jury is still out there. We don't know if this was actually reducing the values that the firms were getting relative to what the workers are getting. So that's something I think we will have to figure out as time passes, because it's possible that providing this amenity was also costly for the firms, and that triggered changes in productivity. So I think that's an open question that I think time will tell us.
Great. Okay, well, I think I'm going to let that be the last word. This was a great first session, so I think we should give a round of applause to our great presenters.